Hello and welcome. I'm attempting my first screencast, so please bear with me. I've got a Prezi set up here that I normally use in my face-to-face classes during a semester, and so the lecture I have for this particular Prezi is much longer, and I'm in the interest of our own sort of online time. I'm trying to pare it down, have a little bit shorter. It's not going to be as dynamic because you won't see me dancing in front of the class, and you'll just hear me talking for long periods of time like you currently are without the screen actually moving. But I wanted to, for the lecture this week, give you this sort of overview of Francis Xavier's travels, which is what you see on the screen right now in these different colored lines, different voyages that he took and different exploits and places that he went. And then I get into Mateo Ricci a little bit. So both of these figures were talked about in that longer essay, Mateo Ricci. Um, but I wanted to, and you may have noticed if you've read those two texts already that were assigned for this week, I have two different takes or styles or texts to draw from that you'll be reading. The David Chittister text, we have a chapter called Asian Heavens for this week. We're going to return to Chittister in each section of the course. So when we get to Asia here, we have a few chapters, Africa and Latin America. We're going to be coming back to Chittister each time. And what Chittister offers us, and again, I'm sorry for the sort of boring screen and you having to listen to my voice without seeing my expressions or anything, but Chittister is a non-Christian academic writer who's coming from a post-colonial perspective. And he's done a lot of his work in the history of Christianity and Christian sort of expansions around the world. And so the text that we're reading from him is on sort of basically, it's called Christianity, a Global Perspective. And I like Chittister's book because it gives us those tensions that I want our course to wrestle with a bit. And the tensions are, what do we do with a Christianity that's supposed to be sort of good in and of itself, right? And yet is so often throughout history what seems to be the cause of suffering and injustice and bad things all around the world, right? And as we begin sort of in Asia this week, and in 2 weeks we get into Africa, and then after that we get into Latin America, we're always going to come back to sort of 1492 and what happens when this small population of Europeans starts spreading its wings, to mix metaphors a little bit, and sailing around the world to different places. They not only bring their desire for trade and wealth, right? They bring religion. They bring Christianity. They bring civilization as they have come to define it up to 1492. In this sort of Christianity in Asia, we're a little bit beyond that, right? So Columbus has already sailed. The New World has already been discovered. Most of Africa has already been sailed around several times, and so what you see on the map here in this large red line is sort of the route that these sailors, these traders, and these missionaries are taking. They start up here in Lisbon, in Portugal, because Portugal has the largest and most strongest naval fleet at this point in European history, and we're sailing around Africa and into sort of India, which is always the first sort of the base station. And so what happens when a very powerful empire, the Portuguese Empire, sets up shop in India, right? Then it creates its own little colony, its own little outpost, its own little Lisbon? Is that the capital of Portugal? Its own little Portugal, right? Right there in the heart of India, right? And from there they cruise out and they do trading, and these missionaries that you read about for this week are following these same routes. So as we get into this, let me we'll start here. This is the best picture I could come up with for Francis Xavier, right? It's fantastic. He looks like a dashing young man, right? He's got his bell in his hand, which is his custom. When he goes into a city, he preaches, ringing his bell, proclaiming what Christianity is all about, and trying to make converts. I'll cruise through Xavier a bit because Ricci is kind of where the action's at with respect to the readings for this week. But the little city of Goa on the western shore of India, this is the little Portugal. This is the little European colonial outpost where these traders from Portugal, from Spain, and then, 100 years later from Britain, France, the Dutch, all these folks will come to this colonial outpost and they'll feel a little bit like home because they rebuild, when they land in Goa, they rebuild the city itself according to colonial architectural standards, European standards. So you get these nice columns and these arches and these other things that isn't native, indigenous to India itself at this time. And you get also this weird mix. You get a lot of missionaries coming over, being sent over by the Pope in Rome to India, and they all start here, right? This is sort of the very first starting point. Xavier himself had a passion for sort of spreading Christianity to Japan. And as you read in that essay, I'll let you read it, but he has various successes and failures. He learns a ton along the way. And the stuff that he learns, right, here it says Xavier dons the silk robe, this sort of acculturation, what do they say? Accommodation is what the author uses the term. He accommodates the Christian message with the cultural forms of the Japanese. And so instead of cruising over there with his black habit robe, right, that's used for, among Jesuit monks in Europe, right, that wouldn't work. He has no cultural cachet, so to speak, with the Japanese, because it just looks like he's some poor guy, poor Westerner. So he dons a silk robe, and so all of a sudden, immediately, his cultural capital begins to grow. He begins to have some conversation now. Some other, the leaders and such, intellectuals, are starting to take him seriously now because he actually looks serious, which is part of the reason why I wear a collared shirt when I teach in class at Regis, is because students tend to take me more seriously, as does my boss. And then they want to hire me back, hopefully. So Xavier here is the first time, coming out of the Middle Ages, Europeans are plagued with the question of, as we begin to expand around the world, what do we do with all of these massive populations that have never heard the Christian message before? In the Middle Ages, it was assumed that everyone had already heard the Christian message, and so we don't have to worry about what happens with heaven and hell and all this kind of stuff. But now we're encountering these people in these new places all around the world, right? So the question is just burning amongst Europeans. What do we do with these people? Xavier is one of the first folks, and he's a Jesuit monk who's appointed actually as a missionary to Asia, right? To cruise over there and begin this process of enculturation, begin this process of navigating that definition that I had you start with last week about the differences between culture and religion. How do we draw those lines? How do we define each of them? Because that actually matters for the sorts of spread of Christianity that happens here, or the sorts of things that we mean, and categories that we put people in when dividing up the world in our various ways that we do. So cruising right along, this is the most recent picture we have of Francis Xavier. His body has actually been pretty well preserved, as you can see. In Asia, it's still there. It's on display. You can actually go and see it. But Xavier paves the way for this guy here, Mateo Ricci. And most of the article in that longer essay is about Mateo Ricci, and Chittister deals with him quite a bit too, because It's with Matteo Ricci and his Jesuit sort of humanist ideals, ideals that say we can know a lot about the world, and that's okay. It all somehow reveals this massive thing that these Christians at this time are calling the glory of God, the sort of the bigness of God, of their God. Mateo Ricci makes the first inroads into China. Now, he starts in Goa as well, right down in here. He sees the poverty and the depravity of the sort of Christian system that the Portuguese have set up in India, where you've got converts, and if they're local indigenous converts, so Indian converts, right, the Portuguese aren't even going to give them a proper education in the catechism, because they presume that these Indians are stupid, that they cannot learn, right? This is a cultural imperialism, as it's come to be known as. But Ricci actually takes seriously Chinese culture. He takes seriously the fact that these people have this depth of wisdom, of knowledge, of things that Europeans can actually benefit by, right? And he takes the time to learn the language, to learn the signs, and as a result is invited across this Great Wall of China into the interior of the country where no Westerner had been allowed before. And it's because he valued them. He wanted to dialogue with them, and he saw that they had something culturally, intellectually, religiously, spiritually, all these things that the West could benefit by. And here's another picture of the wall just to contextualize it with this fantastic man that I hacked this picture off of Google Images somewhere. But anyway, this it works. My joke works better in person, as does this one. Is you gotta just envision the kind of stuff that Ricci came up against as he went into the interior. But he ends up being allowed into the Forbidden City, into Beijing. He never actually meets the emperor at the time. His successor actually does, because the current emperor, when Ricci was in town, was, as the essay talks about, in seclusion most of the time. But the fact that a Westerner is actually allowed into the city speaks volumes for the work that Matteo Ricci did, and not just from within Christianity's perspective, but from a larger civilization perspective. So religion aside, right? Matteo Ricci is able to offer the West something that the West has never had before. And by the West, I mean Europe at this point. They consider themselves all the West, right? We'll get into that later as well. But Ricci brings mathematics, he brings astronomy, he brings all the things that his humanist education has given to him. He gives it and offers it to the Chinese. And in this sort of dialogue that he has with the people he encounters in this culture that he lives, right? He translates their texts, the Chinese texts, into Latin, into the language of the West. In doing so, right, opens up Confucius talk, or Confucius's writings and ideas and wisdom to the West, when the West never had this before, right? This is significant in sort of a world historical sense, irrespective of what happens with sort of this spreading of Christianity. That's mainly what I had for this time, just to orient us here, but to also, as you read through these texts, pay particular attention, right, to especially Chittister, where he talks about the good and the bad coming together. The fact that there are these missionaries like Ricci and Xavier who are actually working hard and valuing culture and trying to dialogue and learn from, not just give, right? In the context of the Portugal and larger European colonial model of go in, extract all the wealth and resources, and make everybody European and make everybody Christian.